Temps R Us in Bellevue has 200 employees on its roster. Places temporary employees all over Puget Sound, including Seattle. How does it apply? Bob, you want to give it a shot? Put you on the spot?
Looks like mine.
Yeah. Well, we were talking in the elevator about you're located in Seattle. So clearly it applies to your employees who work in your Seattle location. What about your temps? Your temps work all over the Puget Sound. So your temps, who are your W-2 employees, accrue paid time off for the time that they work in Seattle. In the case of Temps R Us, they're a tier 2 employer, maybe. They have 200 employees, but are they 200 full-time employees? Temporary agency, maybe not. So you need to look at the full-time equivalency. But assuming they're a tier 2 employer, then their employees accrue at the rate of an hour for every 40 hours worked. They have to be allowed to use 56 hours of paid sick, safe leave in the year. They have to be allowed to carry over those 56 hours.
You hit the space bar or
Oh, the answer
it'll
is,
bring up the
yeah. Okay.
There you go.
So one interesting twist to this law is temporary employees are used to determine an employer's tier size, not your tier size, but the actual temporary employer. So they're used in two different ways. You're the one who's paying out the sick leave to them, allowing them to use it. But their temporary employer has to count them when they're figuring out how big they are for tier purposes.
So isn't it being double counted?
Yes.
Pardon?
It's being double counted then.
Well, it is, except for that the temporary employer is not doing sick leave for that employee.
I see.
So they're not accruing in two different places. They're accruing from their W-2 employer, but they're being used as a body when being counted. So they are kind of, it's being used to bring both companies under the ordinance.
So take that, so if I send somebody out to a practice
Mhm.
and I'm paying them, doing their payroll,
Mhm.
that practice also has to use them as figuring out their FTEs?
Mhm. Yep, this is scenario number 2. Okay, so Ace Accounting has 4 full-time employees. So they're not subject to the ordinance, right? But for 4 months of the year, they bring in 2 temporaries, and they're really busy season, and they work full-time during those 4 months of the year. Now what happens? Now they have more than 4 full-time employees because those temporary employees are counted as Ace Accounting's employees. But the employees are actually coming from Temps R Us, and so it's Temps R Us that has to give the employees their paid time off. It's very complicated. Your brain looks like it's smoking.
No, I get it, I'm just.
Yeah.
But the temp agency isn't responsible for monitoring the client as far as whether he's paying his other 4 employees.
Oh, no. The client, yeah, you're not responsible. I mean, the client has to run his own
I'll let
business in
you worry
a
about
good
it.
way. Was there a question back there that
No,
was
actually,
still?
I think you answered it
Okay.
because I am from the temp agency.
Uh-huh.
We have a branch in Seattle and branches in other places and stuff like that. So when you said when the client was paying the sick leave, it's like, well, wait a minute, there are employees, so as I understand it, we would be paying that sick leave.
You're paying your employees sick leave. But in this case, the temporary employees have pushed the client into a new tier, and so now the client has to pay its own true employees.
But that's the responsibility of the client
yes.
to understand
Oh, yes.
that and
Yep.
monitor, right?
Yep.
That's not our responsibility.
Absolutely.
I just have a quick question. So I have employees that are coming into Seattle, Linwood-based company coming into Seattle. Right now I job cost them, so I do track their hours, but I also job cost the time they spend at the shop or getting there, travel time.
Okay.
But, so I don't have to count that towards their hours, just exactly when their feet are on the ground in Seattle.
Correct. When they're working in Seattle.
Okay.
Right. So sitting in traffic in Seattle, getting there.
No, okay, thank you.
Okay, Wonderful Websites is a Redmond-based company with 8 full-time employees. 3 of its employees work in their Seattle branch. 2 are salaried exempt employees who typically work a 50-hour work week. The other employees non-exempt, so hourly, and sometimes works overtime. So how do we figure out what kind of leave they get? Anybody want to give it a shot? Silence is deafening. Okay, they're a tier 1 employer because they have more than 4 full-time employees, but fewer than 50. So all of its workers who work in Seattle accrue at the rate of 1 hour for every 40 hours worked in Seattle. However, the salaried employees, even though they may work 50 hours a week, they're allowed to count 40 only because they're not paid for those extra 10 hours. They're not subject to overtime. However, the non-exempt employee, she works 45 hours in a week, she gets to count all 45 towards her leave accrual. So in this case, they're all subject to the same requirements, but they may accrue slightly differently, even though, depending on how they're working. That make sense? Okay, ABC Company is based in Issaquah. It has 5 full-time employees. 2 of its employees often travel to Seattle and work with clients there, and 2 primarily cover the east side. And in general, the 2 employees who travel to Seattle each spend about 400 hours in Seattle. Is there a way that ABC can avoid the ordinance legitimately?
Work
Their
with clients or
policy of-
work for clients?
Working with clients in Seattle. So they're consulting, they're coming to Seattle and working in their Seattle location, so their feet are on the ground in Seattle, doing the work.
Well, couldn't they just move some of the Seattle hours to the other employees and get them below 240 a pop?
Bingo. Bingo. So how about instead of having 2 in Seattle and 2 on the east side, we spread that out. And so no employee is working more than 240 hours in Seattle. They've legitimately avoided the ordinance. And that may be something that the Seattle City Council in its wisdom decides to change, but right now, the way the ordinance is written, you can allocate your workload so that none of them are covered.
What about working for, so if I'm gonna do consulting work for, Starbucks, and I go down and I meet with them and say, hi, nice to meet you, here's my file, and I take it back to Bellevue and I sit down and I work on it in Bellevue and I do all my work, so I really I'm doing 400 hours working for clients based in Seattle,
Right?
but I'm gonna be actually physically sitting in Bellevue doing that work.
Okay.
So I'm not subject,
the hours that, you only need to count the hours that you're in Seattle.
that you're actually physically.
Right, that your employee is actually physically in Seattle working.
Okay.
Doesn't matter if they're working for a Seattle-based client, if they're actually physically in Bellevue doing the work,
Mhm.
it doesn't count.
Okay,
So it's just if you have an employee who's going and working on site in Seattle,
mhm.
then those hours count,
Okay.
so.
There was,
So
did you mention that, this is Seattle now, but may go statewide soon?
Yes.
So this is just temporary fixes?
Right, so this strategy, for instance, works now, but if it does go statewide, then probably, we don't know what the state law is gonna look like. Right now, our understanding is it's stalled, it's in committee, so it's not gonna happen in the near future. But maybe in a year, maybe in 2. We don't know how it's gonna work with the Seattle law. We don't know what its limits are gonna be, what its minimums are gonna be. It would be wonderful if, if the state law was, if we didn't have to worry about how those 2 went together, but that's not usually how laws work. So we will see, but this is law. This is coming into effect on September 1st. We have to plan for this. The state law, it may be out there, but we don't know what it looks like yet, so we can't plan for it.
What about companies that in Seattle that send their people outside of Seattle? Those hours don't count?
They're not working in Seattle.
Correct.
So they're not accruing time while they're working outside of Seattle. It is working in Seattle that accrues that time.
Okay. I'm just
That's
thinking.
my understanding.
Just thinking of my caterer who's getting
Right.
rid of all her part-time people and just gonna go with a few full-time just to keep them on. But if
Yeah.
they're out, if she needs them, she can work them outside No, if anybody works, then they have to count their hours, don't they?
My understanding is if you are working in Seattle, those hours are what's counted towards the accrual. Doesn't matter where your employer is based. If you are feet on the ground in Seattle working, those hours count. And so if they reach the 240, then you can start using them. But I would say that you start tracking them from the first day of hire. You know, whether they can use them eventually or after 180 days, we'll cross that bridge, but let's track them from the first date.